Give me one reason not to fire everyone, the billionaire said with a casual smile that didn't reach his eyes. And in that moment the entire restaurant stopped breathing, because when Daniel Whitmore joked about firing people, it was never really a joke. And no one in the Whitmore Grand Dining Room knew that better than the staff, standing silently along the polished marble wall, their black uniforms neat, their shoulders tight, their eyes carefully lowered toward the imported oak floor that had cost more per square foot than most of them made in a week. Outside the tall glass windows the Manhattan evening glowed with soft gold light reflecting off steel towers and passing yellow taxis. But inside the private dining hall the air felt colder, heavier, like a storm waiting to break. Daniel Whitmore leaned back slightly in his chair, one arm resting over the leather backrest, the kind of relaxed posture that only came from decades of power. His charcoal suit tailored so precisely it looked like it had been drawn onto him, his silver watch catching the light every time his wrist moved. Around him stood managers, supervisors, chefs, and servers from the Whitmore Grand's flagship restaurant, all summoned with almost no warning after the quarterly numbers had crossed his desk that morning. The silence stretched long enough for the faint hum of the building's ventilation system to become noticeable, a quiet mechanical breath moving through the ceiling vents, steady and indifferent to the tension below. Daniel's eyes moved slowly across the room, not angry, not loud, just curious in the way a man might study a chessboard before removing several pieces at once. The restaurant manager cleared his throat softly, but said nothing, because everyone here understood the unspoken rule of Whitmore Properties. When the billionaire asked a question, you answered carefully, and when he joked, you prayed he stayed amused. Near the back of the room, standing beside a small service station where coffee cups were stacked in perfect rows, Emily Carter held a silver tray against her waist and watched quietly, her posture calm in a way that didn't match the tension surrounding her. She had worked the evening shift for nearly a year now, long enough to memorize the rhythm of the place, the rush at 7 p.m., the lull around 9:30, the quiet clink of glasses when the last guests drifted out near midnight. She knew which tables tipped well, which customers preferred sparkling water instead of still, which managers panicked when important people walked through the door. But tonight was different. Tonight the owner himself had walked in without warning, and the energy in the room had shifted instantly. Daniel Whitmore tapped one finger lightly on the table, the soft sound echoing just enough to remind everyone he was still waiting. Come on, he said lightly, almost amused. It's a simple question. No one moved. The executive chef stared at the floor. The assistant manager blinked too quickly. Someone near the kitchen doorway shifted their weight from one foot to the other. Outside, a taxi horn echoed faintly from the avenue below. Inside, the quiet grew deeper. Daniel exhaled through his nose, smiling slightly, as if the entire situation entertained him. One reason, he repeated. The words floated across the room like a test. Emily Carter watched the managers, watched the billionaire, watched the numbers on the printed report sitting in front of him. She had seen those numbers earlier that afternoon when a copy had been left briefly on the service counter. Revenue down, average check declining, weekend reservations thinner than expected for a five-star property, the kind of trend that made executives nervous and billionaires curious. Daniel leaned forward now, folding his hands together, his voice softer but somehow sharper. You're telling me, he said, that not one person here has a reason this place should keep its entire staff? The question lingered, and then, from the quiet edge of the room, a calm voice spoke before anyone could stop it. Because the problem isn't them. The sentence was not loud. It did not interrupt. It simply appeared in the air, clear and steady, like a single note played in a silent hall. Daniel Whitmore turned his head slowly toward the back of the room, his expression shifting from mild amusement to something else, something sharper. The managers looked up, the chef straightened, the staff exchanged brief, stunned glances, and standing beside the coffee station, still holding her tray, Emily Carter met the billionaire's gaze without raising her voice, without stepping forward, without even realizing that in the next few seconds the quietest person in the room was about to change the direction of the entire conversation. Daniel Whitmore did not speak immediately, and the silence that followed felt heavier than before, because now every person in the room understood that the voice had come from someone who was not supposed to speak at all. His eyes moved across the dining room until they stopped on the young woman standing beside the coffee station. And for a moment the billionaire simply studied her the way an investor studies an unfamiliar chart that suddenly shows an unexpected pattern. Emily Carter remained still, the silver tray balanced lightly against her waist, her posture relaxed but not careless, her expression calm in a way that seemed almost out of place among the nervous glances spreading across the room. The restaurant manager shifted uneasily and took half a step forward as if preparing to apologize for her. But Daniel lifted one finger slightly without looking away from Emily, and the manager froze again. Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair, the leather creaking softly beneath his jacket as he crossed one leg over the other, the faint reflection of the chandelier lights dancing across the polished surface of his watch. "The problem is not them," he repeated quietly, his voice thoughtful rather than angry, and the words echoed through the room like a question that had just begun to grow roots. Several employees exchanged cautious glances, unsure whether the moment would end in laughter or consequences. Emily noticed those glances but did not react to them because her attention remained on the man sitting at the long oak table. She had read about Daniel Whitmore before she ever worked inside one of his hotels. Business magazines liked to describe him as a visionary, financial analysts called him relentless, and hospitality employees usually used one simpler word when he walked into a room without warning: unpredictable. Daniel tilted his head slightly as he watched her, curiosity slowly replacing amusement in his eyes. "And who exactly are you?" he asked after a moment. The question sounded simple, but everyone in the room understood what it really meant. Emily shifted the tray onto the counter beside her and folded her hands together lightly, not in fear, not in defiance, simply because it felt natural to stand that way when speaking. "My name is Emily Carter, sir," she said calmly. Her voice carried across the quiet dining room without effort, steady and clear. "I work the evening service shift here." Daniel nodded once, absorbing the answer. But his gaze did not move away from her face. The assistant manager looked as though he might faint. The executive chef rubbed his forehead slowly, and someone near the kitchen doorway inhaled sharply before remembering to remain silent. Daniel tapped the financial report with the edge of his finger. The paper made a soft sound against the table. "Emily Carter," he said thoughtfully, as if testing the name the way a person might test a new idea. "You seem confident about the problem not being the staff." Emily did not rush her reply. She glanced briefly toward the long row of employees standing along the wall, then back to the billionaire. "Yes, sir," she said simply. Daniel raised one eyebrow, a subtle movement that somehow increased the tension in the room. "Interesting," he murmured. The faint hum of the building's air system continued above them, while the evening traffic far below drifted through the windows like distant waves. Daniel leaned forward now, resting his forearms on the table, his attention fully focused on the waitress standing near the coffee station. "Then tell me something, Emily Carter," he said slowly, the trace of a smile returning to the corner of his mouth. "If the problem is not the people working here, what exactly is it?" The question settled over the room like a spotlight turning toward a single stage. Every employee in the dining hall watched her now, some with disbelief, others with quiet hope, and a few with the silent warning that she had already said too much. Emily felt those eyes but did not lower her gaze. Instead, she looked at the printed report in front of Daniel Whitmore, then at the elegant dining room around them, the crystal glasses, the polished tables, the menu stands placed precisely at each setting. And in that moment, the waitress who spent most nights refilling water glasses understood something that many of the managers in the room had overlooked for months. She took a slow breath and spoke again, still calm, still measured, unaware that the next few sentences would begin to change the direction of an entire business conversation. Emily Carter did not answer immediately, and that small pause seemed to stretch across the entire dining room, because everyone present understood that whatever she said next could either end the conversation or change it completely. Daniel Whitmore watched her carefully, his expression patient, the faint smile still resting at the corner of his mouth as if he were waiting for an interesting story rather than a nervous explanation. Emily glanced once more at the printed financial report on the table in front of him, then lifted her eyes back to his face. The problem is the positioning, sir, she said calmly. A faint ripple of confusion moved through the room because the words sounded more like something from a business meeting than from a waitress taking dinner. Orders. Daniel's eyebrow lifted slightly again, curiosity sharpening his attention. Positioning, he repeated. Emily nodded once. Yes, sir. The restaurant does not match the expectations created by the brand name of this hotel. Several managers exchanged uneasy looks, but none of them interrupted. Emily continued speaking with the same steady tone, not louder, not faster, simply clear. Guests walk into the Whitmore Grand expecting a luxury dining experience. The dining room looks like one. The service style suggests one, but the menu pricing and structure belong to a mid-tier chain restaurant. The executive chef blinked in surprise, while the assistant manager quietly shifted his weight again. Daniel's eyes moved slowly toward the menu card placed at the center of the table. Emily noticed the movement and continued. For example, the grilled salmon here is priced at $28, which might work in a casual restaurant, but guests staying in a 5-star hotel expect premium options, and they associate higher prices with quality and exclusivity. Daniel tapped the menu lightly with one finger, thinking. Emily spoke again before the room could fall back into silence. When prices appear too low for the environment, guests subconsciously assume the experience is ordinary, so they order less and leave earlier. That lowers the average check and reduces the perceived value of the entire restaurant. A faint murmur moved through the staff along the wall because the explanation sounded disturbingly logical. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair again, but this time his eyes did not leave Emily's face. You are suggesting the restaurant is too cheap, he said slowly. Emily shook her head gently. Not exactly cheap, sir. Just misaligned with the identity of the hotel. Daniel's fingers drummed softly against the report as he considered her words. Outside the windows, a distant siren echoed down the avenue, fading quickly into the city noise. Inside the room, the silence returned, but now it felt different, less tense and more focused. Daniel lifted the financial report again and glanced at the revenue column. Emily continued quietly, almost as if she were explaining something obvious. If the menu reflected the same level of exclusivity as the hotel itself, guests would stay longer, explore more dishes, and treat dinner as part of the luxury experience rather than a convenient meal. The restaurant manager stared at her as though seeing her for the first time. The executive chef slowly crossed his arms while thinking through the numbers in his head. Daniel Whitmore finally placed the report back on the table and looked directly at the waitress standing near the coffee station. The hint of amusement that had been in his expression earlier was gone now, replaced by something far more attentive. That is an interesting observation for someone who refills water glasses, he said quietly. Emily did not look embarrassed. She simply nodded once. I notice patterns, sir. The room remained silent again, but this time the silence carried a different meaning, because the quiet voice that had spoken from the back of the dining hall no longer sounded like a mistake. It sounded like someone who understood the numbers almost as well as the man who owned the building. Daniel Whitmore did not respond right away, and the quiet in the room shifted again, no longer tense but thoughtful, as if the entire staff had just witnessed something unexpected unfold in slow motion. He leaned back in his chair, studying Emily Carter with the same careful attention a seasoned investor might give to a surprising market signal. The faint hum of the lights above mixed with the distant rhythm of traffic far below the hotel's tall windows, but inside the dining room, every person seemed to wait for the billionaire's reaction. Daniel slowly lifted the menu card from the table and turned it slightly in his hands, scanning the prices printed beside each dish. Grilled salmon $28, filet steak $34, lobster pasta $32. He placed the card back down and tapped it lightly with his finger. You are telling me, he said calmly, that our problem is not service, not staff discipline, not food quality, but something as simple as pricing and perception. Emily did not rush to defend her idea. Instead, she spoke the same way she had since the beginning, steady and measured. It is not only the price itself, sir. It is the message the price sends. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly with interest. Emily continued, her voice carrying clearly through the dining room. Guests at a hotel like this are not just buying food. They are buying the feeling of being somewhere exceptional. When the environment promises one experience, but the menu suggests another, guests become uncertain about the value of staying longer. The executive chef quietly rubbed his chin as if mentally recalculating something. The restaurant manager shifted his stance again, his earlier anxiety slowly turning into reluctant curiosity. Daniel folded his hands together and watched her for several seconds before asking the next question. "And how exactly did you arrive at this conclusion, Emily Carter?" The question hung in the air, not aggressive, simply direct. Emily glanced briefly toward the dining room tables, arranged in neat rows across the polished floor. "Because I watch what guests do," she answered. Daniel tilted his head slightly. Emily explained without hesitation. "When a couple sits down for dinner here, they usually order one main dish each and maybe a shared appetizer. They rarely order a second course or dessert. The average dinner lasts less than 50 minutes. Several managers looked surprised because the number sounded very close to the actual reports. Emily continued. "In luxury restaurants, guests stay longer because the experience feels special. They explore the menu. They order wine, desserts, and sometimes a second dish. Here the environment suggests that kind of evening. But the menu structure encourages a quick meal instead." Daniel rested one elbow on the table and leaned forward slightly, now fully engaged. "You have been tracking this," he said quietly. Emily gave a small nod. "Not formally, sir. I just noticed patterns during my shifts." The assistant manager looked stunned. The executive chef stared at the menu again as if it had suddenly become a puzzle. Daniel Whitmore allowed himself a small, thoughtful smile. The amusement from earlier had disappeared completely, replaced by something closer to respect. "Interesting," he said. His gaze moved briefly toward the line of employees standing along the wall before returning to Emily. "Most people in this room have been reviewing those reports for weeks." He paused, then added calmly. "And yet the person who explained the situation most clearly works the evening service shift." The quiet that followed was not uncomfortable this time. It felt like the moment after a puzzle piece finally clicks into place. Daniel leaned back again, crossing his arms as he studied the waitress near the coffee station. "Tell me something else, Emily Carter," he said slowly, his voice thoughtful now rather than testing. "If you believe the positioning is wrong, what would you change first?" Emily Carter listened to the question, and for a moment she did not move, as if she were carefully arranging the thoughts in her mind before placing them into the quiet space of the dining room. The eyes of every employee remained fixed on her, but she did not seem intimidated by the attention. Instead, she glanced slowly around the restaurant itself, at the polished tables, the tall windows overlooking the glowing Manhattan streets, the soft lighting reflecting off rows of crystal glasses. It was the kind of room designed to impress, the kind of room that suggested a long evening of conversation and celebration. Then she looked back at Daniel Whitmore and answered with the same calm voice she had used from the beginning. "The first thing I would change is the story the menu tells." Daniel's expression shifted slightly with interest. "The story," he repeated. Emily nodded. "Yes, sir. Every restaurant menu tells a story about what kind of place it is. Right now this one tells two different stories at the same time." Several managers exchanged puzzled glances, but Daniel remained focused. Emily continued carefully, choosing her words with the quiet precision of someone who had spent many nights observing rather than speaking. "The dining room says this is an exclusive place where people celebrate special moments. The menu says it is a convenient place to eat dinner before going somewhere else." The executive chef slowly straightened, his curiosity now obvious. Emily spoke. Again, her voice steady. "I would redesign the menu so the experience feels intentional from the moment a guest opens it. Fewer items, but each one described with purpose. Dishes that feel unique to the hotel, instead of familiar dishes guests can order anywhere else." Daniel tapped the edge of the menu card thoughtfully as she spoke. Emily continued. "I would also adjust the pricing structure so it reflects the environment. Guests staying here are not searching for the lowest price. They are searching for a memorable experience. When the price signals quality and confidence, guests relax and explore the menu instead of rushing through dinner." The assistant manager slowly nodded without realizing he had done so. Emily noticed, but continued calmly. "The second change would involve how the courses are presented. Right now servers take orders quickly because they assume guests want efficiency. But luxury dining is not about speed. It is about pacing. Daniel leaned slightly forward. Again, Emily explained. If servers guide the meal in stages, suggesting a starter, a main course, and a dessert, guests naturally stay longer, and the evening feels more complete. Longer experiences increase the average check without making anyone feel pressured. The restaurant manager blinked, as if a light had quietly turned on in his mind. The executive chef looked toward Daniel Whitmore, as if waiting for the billionaire's reaction. Daniel remained silent, his eyes steady on Emily Carter. She added one final thought in the same calm tone. None of these changes require replacing the people who work here. The staff already provides good service. They simply need a structure that supports the experience the hotel promises. The quiet that followed felt different again, not tense, not nervous, but thoughtful. Daniel Whitmore slowly leaned back in his chair and looked around the room, his gaze moving from the chefs to the managers and finally back to the waitress standing near the coffee station. A faint smile returned to his face, but this time it was not the amused smile of a billionaire testing his employees. It was the expression of someone who had just discovered an unexpected idea in the most unlikely place. For several seconds Daniel Whitmore said nothing, and the quiet inside the dining room seemed to deepen again as every person present waited for the billionaire to respond to the calm explanation that had just come from a waitress standing beside the coffee station. He leaned back slowly in his chair and looked around the room, not quickly, but with the slow, deliberate movement of someone reconsidering everything he had assumed only minutes earlier. The restaurant manager shifted nervously, while the executive chef folded his arms and stared at the floor as if replaying Emily Carter's words in his mind. The financial report still rested on the table in front of Daniel, its numbers now appearing less like a problem of discipline and more like a puzzle that had finally begun to make sense. Daniel tapped the paper lightly once before lifting his eyes again toward Emily. "You have clearly thought about this," he said quietly. Emily did not appear proud or nervous. She simply nodded once. "I notice things during my shifts, sir." Daniel studied her face carefully, as if measuring the sincerity behind those simple words. "Most people in this room," he said slowly, "have formal training in hospitality management or business administration, yet the person who just explained the situation most clearly spends her evenings carrying trays between tables." The assistant manager lowered his eyes slightly, not embarrassed exactly, but thoughtful. Daniel continued speaking in the same calm tone. "Tell me something honestly, Emily Carter, where did you learn to analyze a business this way?" The question did not sound accusatory. It sounded genuinely curious. Emily hesitated for the first time since she had spoken earlier, not because she seemed afraid, but because the answer required explaining something personal. She glanced briefly toward the windows where the evening lights of Manhattan reflected across the glass towers of neighboring buildings. Then she looked back at Daniel Whitmore and answered simply, "I studied economics before I started working here." A quiet ripple moved through the staff along the wall because that was not the answer anyone had expected. Daniel's expression changed slightly. Again, the interest in his eyes sharpening. "Economics," he repeated. Emily nodded. "Yes, sir. I attended Columbia University for 3 years." The restaurant manager blinked with open surprise. The executive chef turned his head slowly toward her. Daniel remained still, his gaze focused. 3 years, he said thoughtfully. "What happened after that?" Emily did not look away. "My father became ill and I needed to work full-time," she explained calmly. The words were not dramatic. They sounded like a simple fact of life. The quiet that followed carried a new kind of respect because the explanation was both ordinary and unexpected at the same time. Daniel Whitmore leaned forward slightly again, resting his forearms on the table, as if the conversation had quietly transformed into something more important than a routine review of restaurant numbers. The billionaire who had entered the room minutes earlier prepared to fire an entire staff, now looked at the young waitress with the expression of someone discovering a different kind of asset. Altogether, he glanced once more at the financial report, then back at Emily Carter. A faint, thoughtful smile returned to his face. "It seems," he said slowly, "that the Whitmore Grand has more talent in this room than its management reports have been showing." The quiet that followed Daniel Whitmore's last sentence carried a weight that felt different from the tension earlier in the evening. Because now the silence inside the dining room was filled with a new realization slowly spreading through the staff. The billionaire who had walked in prepared to dismiss everyone was now sitting at the same table, studying a waitress, as if she had just revealed something far more valuable than a mistake in the numbers. Daniel glanced again at the financial report, then folded the paper calmly and placed it beside the menu. Interesting, he said quietly, almost to himself. The restaurant manager shifted slightly, as if unsure whether he should speak, but Daniel lifted his hand again with a small gesture that kept the room silent. His attention returned to Emily Carter, who still stood beside the coffee station with the same calm posture she had maintained from the beginning. Daniel leaned forward, resting his hands on the table as he considered his next words carefully. "You studied economics for 3 years," he said. Emily nodded once. "Yes, sir." Daniel tilted his head slightly as he studied her expression, and during those 3 years, he continued slowly. "You learned to analyze businesses, pricing structures, and consumer behavior." Emily answered simply, "Yes, sir." Daniel tapped the edge of the menu card again, his mind clearly moving through the ideas she had explained. The executives along the wall watched quietly, some still surprised, others beginning to understand that the conversation had shifted far beyond a routine staff review. Daniel finally spoke again, his voice calm but focused. "Then I have another question for you, Emily Carter." The room became still again. "If you were sitting in this chair instead of me," he said, lightly touching the table in front of him, "what would be the first practical step you would take tomorrow morning to change the direction of this restaurant?" The question seemed simple, but everyone present understood what it meant. The billionaire was no longer testing her. He was listening. Emily did not rush to answer. She glanced briefly around the room, at the chefs who created the meals, the servers who guided guests through the dining experience, the managers who watched the reservation lists each evening. When she spoke again, her voice carried the same calm clarity. "Tomorrow morning, I would start by redefining the experience for the team," she said. Daniel watched her closely. Emily continued, "If the staff understands the story the restaurant is meant to tell, every decision becomes easier. How we greet guests, how we pace the meal, how we describe the dishes, it all becomes part of the same experience." The executive chef slowly nodded without realizing it. Emily explained further. "Then I would simplify the menu so each dish represents the identity of the hotel. Fewer options but stronger ones. Something guests cannot find at another restaurant down the street." Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly with concentration as he pictured the idea. Emily added calmly, "Once the identity becomes clear, the pricing and presentation follow naturally. Guests recognize authenticity when they see it." The room remained quiet again, but the quiet now carried a quiet sense of respect. Daniel Whitmore leaned back slowly in his chair and looked around the dining room once more before returning his gaze to Emily Carter. The faint smile returned to his face, but this time it was the smile of someone who had just discovered an unexpected answer to a question he had not originally planned to ask. Daniel Whitmore remained silent for a long moment after Emily Carter finished speaking, and the quiet inside the dining room felt almost reflective now, as if every person present had begun to see the restaurant through a slightly different lens. The billionaire slowly rose from his chair, the subtle movement immediately drawing every pair of eyes in the room toward him. He walked a few steps away from the table and glanced around the dining hall, taking in details that had likely existed for years but had never demanded his attention in quite the same way. The soft lighting above the tables, the elegant spacing between each setting, the large windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline. All of it suggested the kind of place where people expected something memorable to happen. Daniel placed his hands lightly on the back of one of the chairs and looked toward the long row of employees standing near the wall. Some of them avoided his gaze out of habit, while others now watched him with quiet curiosity. Finally, he turned his attention back toward Emily Carter, who still stood calmly beside the coffee station. "You know something interesting," Daniel said thoughtfully, his voice steady and calm. "When I walked into this room tonight, I believed the problem was simple. I thought the restaurant had lost discipline or motivation." He paused briefly, glancing again at the folded report still resting on the table. "But discipline is not the problem here." Several staff members exchanged brief glances as they listened. Daniel continued slowly, choosing his words carefully. The real problem was that the leadership of this place forgot what experience we were supposed to create. The executive chef lowered his eyes slightly, as if acknowledging the truth behind that statement. Daniel turned fully toward the staff now. "A luxury hotel does not sell meals," he said. "It sells moments people remember long after they leave." The words hung quietly in the air as the employees listened. Daniel then looked back at Emily Carter, the faint smile returning to his face. And tonight the clearest explanation of that idea came from someone who technically was not even part of the management team. The restaurant manager shifted again, though this time the movement carried more humility than anxiety. Daniel walked slowly back to the table and picked up the menu card once more, holding it lightly between his fingers. "You suggested redefining the story this restaurant tells," he said to Emily. She nodded slightly. Daniel studied the menu again for a few seconds before setting it down. "You also suggested simplifying the choices so each dish becomes part of a stronger identity." Emily nodded again. Daniel looked toward the chefs standing near the kitchen in trance. "That might actually be the most valuable advice this room has heard in months." The executive chef straightened slightly at the comment. Daniel returned his attention to Emily. Once more, his voice calm but sincere. "Tell me something else, Emily Carter," he said slowly. "Have you ever considered working in hospitality management rather than serving tables during the evening shift?" The question surprised several people in the room, though Emily herself did not react dramatically. She simply answered with the same quiet honesty she had shown all evening. "I have considered many things, sir," she said. Daniel's faint smile widened just a little. He looked around the dining room. Again, then back at her. "Good," he said thoughtfully. "Because sometimes the most valuable perspective in a room comes from the person who spent the longest time quietly observing it." Daniel Whitmore let the quiet linger after Emily Carter answered him, and the silence inside the dining room now felt completely different from the tense stillness that had filled the room earlier that evening. The staff along the wall were no longer bracing for a wave of firings, and the managers were no longer watching the floor in nervous anticipation. Instead, everyone seemed to be watching the same person, the waitress standing calmly beside the coffee station, who had spoken only a few sentences but somehow changed the direction of the entire conversation. Daniel slowly walked back toward the long table and picked up the folded financial report once more. He looked at the numbers again, but this time the figures seemed less like evidence of failure and more like a set of clues pointing toward a simple misunderstanding of the restaurant's purpose. He placed the report down carefully and turned to face the staff. "Earlier tonight," he said calmly, "I asked for one reason not to fire everyone in this room." A few employees exchanged uneasy smiles at the memory of how tense that moment had felt. Daniel continued speaking in the same measured tone. "I expected excuses or silence, because that is usually what people offer when leadership asks difficult questions." He paused briefly, glancing toward Emily Carter before finishing the thought. "Instead, I received something far more useful. I received perspective." The words seemed to settle over the room with quiet weight. Daniel folded his hands together behind his back and looked across the dining room one more time. The polished tables, the glowing lights of Manhattan beyond the windows, the staff who had worked countless evenings here serving guests they would never meet again. "No one is being fired tonight," he said simply. A soft exhale moved through the room as the tension finally dissolved completely. The restaurant manager straightened slightly, while the executive chef allowed himself the faintest hint of a relieved smile. Daniel then turned back toward Emily Carter. "However," he added thoughtfully, "this conversation should not end with one observation during a staff meeting." Emily met his gaze calmly. Daniel walked a few steps closer to where she stood, stopping a respectful distance away. "Emily Carter," he said, "tomorrow morning I want you to join the management team for a strategy session about the future of this restaurant." The words caused several employees to look at one another with quiet surprise. Emily blinked once, not dramatically, but with the small expression of someone realizing that a quiet evening shift had unexpectedly turned into something else entirely. Daniel's voice remained calm. "You have spent the last year observing how this place actually works. That perspective is something most executives rarely receive." Emily nodded slowly. "If you believe the story of this restaurant can be improved," Daniel continued, "then you deserve the opportunity to help rewrite it." The dining room remained silent again, But this time the silence felt warm, almost hopeful. Daniel Whitmore allowed himself a small satisfied smile before glancing once more around the room. Sometimes, he said quietly, the most valuable voice in a room is the one no one thought to ask. And as the staff began to relax and the quiet hum of the hotel returned to its normal rhythm, everyone present understood that the evening had not been remembered as the night the billionaire nearly fired everyone. It would be remembered as the night a quiet waitress spoke, and the entire room finally listened.